The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a registered letter. I was sipping my morning coffee, a dark roast with just a splash of almond milk that had become my small daily luxury since the divorce, sorting through the usual bills and advertisements, when I spotted the official-looking envelope with the county clerk's stamp. The morning sun streamed through my kitchen windows, casting warm rectangles of light across the butcher block counter I'd installed last summer, illuminating the envelope's formal typeface that seemed suddenly ominous. My name is Rebecca Wells, and 6 months earlier, I had finalized my divorce from Alan after 15 years of marriage. It hadn't been amicable, few divorces are, but I thought we'd reached a fair settlement. I would keep our house on Maple Street, the one we'd renovated together room by room over a decade, while Alan would keep the vacation cabin in the mountains and his considerable retirement accounts. The cabin had been our weekend retreat, a place where we'd spent countless holidays and summer evenings before everything fell apart. I had loved it, but I loved my primary home more. It was my anchor in the community, close to my friends and the life I'd built. The house represented stability when everything else had crumbled. It seemed like a clean break, the best possible outcome from the wreckage of a relationship that had slowly crumbled under the weight of Alan's controlling nature and serial infidelities. His affairs had started in our 10th year of marriage, at least, that's when I discovered the first one. His assistant, of course, the most cliched of betrayals. There had been others after that, each one followed by tearful apologies, promises to change, couples therapy that never quite took. The final straw had been finding text messages from not one but 2 different women on his phone during what was supposed to be our anniversary dinner. I'd excused myself to the bathroom, taken his phone to look up an address, and found myself staring at intimate exchanges that made it clear my husband had been living a double life, or perhaps a triple one. I tore open the envelope with my index finger, feeling the slight resistance of the heavy paper, expecting perhaps some final paperwork, a tax notification, something routine. Instead, I found myself staring at a deed transfer document for my house, showing that I had supposedly signed over my property to Alan 3 weeks earlier. The document was crisp, official, with stamps and signatures that looked terrifyingly legitimate. My coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering on the kitchen tile with a crash that matched the sudden fracturing of my sense of security. The hot liquid splashed across my bare feet, but I barely felt it. That was impossible. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't seen Alan in months. Yet there was my signature, or something close enough to it, on the dotted line, the familiar loops and slants that I recognized, yet with subtle differences that only I would notice. Someone had studied my handwriting enough to create a convincing forgery. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and called my divorce attorney, Margaret Chen. Margaret had been my rock throughout the divorce proceedings, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s with a reputation for being ruthlessly effective without the dramatics that some lawyers brought to family court. She had navigated me through the worst days with practical advice and occasional dry humor that had kept me grounded. "This is fraud," I said without preamble when she answered, my voice tight with panic. "He forged my signature." "Slow down, Rebecca," Margaret replied, her voice calm and steady as always, the slight hint of her Boston accent more pronounced when she spoke firmly. "What's happened?" I explained about the document, reading her the reference numbers, the date, the notary information. As I spoke, I paced the kitchen, the broken ceramic crunching beneath my slippers, leaving small coffee-colored footprints on the white tile. Outside, I could see Mrs. Peterson walking her corgi, the neighborhood continuing its normal rhythm while my world tilted on its axis. "I need you to scan this and send it to me immediately," she instructed. "Don't contact Alan. Don't contact the county clerk yet. Let me look into this first. Her decisive tone helped center me, giving me a clear action to focus on instead of the spiral of panic threatening to overtake me. I did as she asked, carefully photographing each page of the document before emailing them to her. Then I paced my kitchen, crunching over the shards of my broken mug, too agitated to clean them up. The house I stood in, my grandmother's mahogany dining table that had hosted 40 years of family gatherings, the reading nook I'd built into the bay window with its cushions in my favorite shade of teal, the garden visible through the French doors where I'd planted roses and herbs in meticulously planned arrangements, none of it was mine anymore, according to that document. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter, feeling the smooth stone beneath my fingertips. Alan and I had argued about this counter for weeks. He'd wanted granite, sleek, impressive, what all his colleagues had in their showcase homes. I'd insisted on soapstone, warmer, more natural, developing a patina over time that told the story of a lived-in home. I'd won that battle, one of the few times I'd stood my ground successfully during our marriage. Now even that small victory seemed precarious. Margaret called back within the hour, catching me still standing in the kitchen, staring unseeing at the garden where the first daffodils of spring were pushing through the soil. It's definitely fraud, she confirmed, but it's sophisticated fraud. The notary is real, Pamela Johnson from the UPS store on 5th Street. The paperwork appears to have been filed correctly. Someone put effort into making this look legitimate. Her voice held a note of grudging professional respect for the thoroughness of the deception, even as her words confirmed my worst fears. It had to be Alan, I insisted, gripping the phone tighter. Who else would do this? I agree it's the obvious conclusion, Margaret said, her tone guarded. But we need proof before we make accusations. I'm going to contact this notary and see what she remembers. In the meantime, gather any evidence you have that you've been living in the house continuously. Utility bills, mail, neighbors who can vouch for you. We need to establish that you never intended to transfer the property. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table, stunned. The morning sun now seemed too bright, almost mocking in its cheerfulness. Alan had always been manipulative, controlling our finances, making major decisions without consulting me, gaslighting me when I questioned his late nights or unexplained expenses. But this was criminal. This crossed a line I hadn't imagined even he would dare to cross. The sense of violation was overwhelming, a physical sensation like fingers crawling beneath my skin. He had stolen my identity, my signature, to take away the one thing I had fought hardest for in our divorce, the security of my home, my sanctuary. I remembered how hard I'd fought during the settlement negotiations, how Alan's attorney had pushed for selling the house and splitting the proceeds. It's just a house, Alan had said dismissively across the mediation table. We can both start fresh. But it wasn't just a house to me. It was the place where I'd finally begun to find myself again after years of slowly disappearing into the shadow of his larger personality. I pulled myself together enough to start gathering the evidence Margaret had requested. As I sorted through bills and bank statements, organized by month in the filing system I'd implemented after Alan moved out, my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. I tried to warn you not to fight me on the cabin. Actions have consequences, Becca. My blood ran cold, an actual physical chill racing through my body. Alan had always called me Becca, despite my repeated requests not to. My family called me Rebecca or Becky, never Becca. He knew how much I hated that nickname, which was precisely why he used it. The message disappeared as I was staring at it, one of those self-deleting texts from an app designed to leave no trace. I called Margaret back immediately. He just texted me, I told her, moving to the living room window to scan the street, suddenly paranoid that he might be watching the house. Basically admitted it was retaliation for the divorce settlement. Did you screenshot it? Her question was immediate, practical. It deleted before I could. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, trying to steady myself. Margaret sighed. Not surprising. He's being careful. But this gives us direction. She paused, and I could almost see her tapping her pen against her desk, a habit I'd noticed during our meetings. Rebecca, I think you should stay with a friend for a few days. If Alan has gone this far, I'm concerned about what else he might do. I'm not leaving my house, I replied firmly, straightening my spine. That's exactly what he wants. The thought of abandoning my home, even temporarily, made my stomach clench. It would feel like conceding, like giving Alan another victory. Then at least change your locks. Today. And consider installing some security cameras. Her pragmatism cut through my emotional response, reminding me that standing my ground didn't mean being reckless. I followed her advice, calling a locksmith who arrived that afternoon to replace every lock in the house, front door, back door, even the rarely used side entrance to the garden. The locksmith, a burly man named Dave with graying temples and gentle hands, worked quickly and efficiently, explaining each new feature as he installed them. These are bump-proof locks, he said, demonstrating how the key worked in the new front door deadbolt. Much harder to pick than your old ones. And I'd recommend keeping your windows locked too, especially at night or when you're out. As he worked, I found myself jumping at every sound, peering through windows, scanning the street for Alan's silver BMW. The house that had been my sanctuary now felt vulnerable, penetrable. I imagined Alan with copies of my keys, letting himself in while I slept, standing over my bed. The thought made me shudder. That evening, as the spring twilight settled over the neighborhood and the streetlights flickered on, my doorbell rang just as I was finishing dinner. A simple plate of pasta with the pesto I'd made last fall from my garden's basil harvest and frozen in small batches. Through the peephole, I saw my neighbor Diane, a retired librarian with cropped silver hair and perpetually ink-stained fingers who had lived next door for as long as I'd been on Maple Street. "Rebecca, dear, is everything all right?" she asked when I opened the door, her keen blue eyes scanning my face with concern. "I noticed the locksmith today and wanted to check on you." I hesitated, unsure how much to share, but Diane's concerned face broke through my reserve. I invited her in and explained the situation over tea, chamomile for me to calm my frayed nerves, Earl Grey for Diane who insisted caffeine never affected her sleep. "That snake," she muttered when I finished, setting her teacup down with more force than necessary. "I never liked him, you know. Too slick, too practiced. Like he was always performing." I smiled despite myself. Diane had never been one to mince words. During the worst of my marital troubles, she had been a quiet but steady presence, never prying but always available for a cup of tea and conversation that carefully avoided asking why my eyes were red from crying. "The thing is," I admitted, tracing the rim of my cup with my finger, "I'm scared. Not just about the house, but about what else he might do. Alan doesn't handle losing well." I thought about the tennis racket he'd smashed after losing a club tournament, the icy silence that would descend for days if a work project went to a colleague instead of him. Alan's pride was a living thing, a beast that required constant feeding. Diane reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her skin cool and paper dry against mine. "You listen to me, Rebecca Wells. You are not alone in this fight. I've lived next door for 12 years. I've seen you come and go every day. I've collected your mail when you visited your sister last spring. I've borrowed sugar and returned garden tools. I will swear on a stack of Bibles that you have never left this house, never intended to give it up. Tears pricked my eyes at her fierce loyalty. Thank you, Diane. Now, she said, straightening her spine, her librarian's posture asserting itself, tell me what else I can do to help. Actually, I replied, an idea forming, there is something. The next morning, after a restless night where every creak of the house settling had jolted me awake, I visited the UPS store on 5th Street, the location of the notary who had supposedly witnessed my signature. The strip mall where it was located had seen better days, the neighboring dry cleaner had gone out of business during the pandemic, and the Chinese restaurant at the end had a perpetual grand opening sign despite being there for at least 3 years. The store was small, with a counter for shipping services and a wall of mailboxes. A young woman with a name tag identifying her as Jessica greeted me, her customer service smile firmly in place. I'm looking for Pamela Johnson, I said, conscious of the slight tremor in my voice. She's a notary here. That's me, called a voice from the back. A middle-aged woman with curly gray hair and fashionable purple-framed glasses emerged, smiling professionally. How can I help you? I introduced myself and watched her face carefully for any recognition. Nothing flickered in her expression, no surprise, no guilt, nothing to suggest she remembered my name from the fraudulent document. I believe you notarized a deed transfer with my signature recently, I said, producing a copy of the document Margaret had sent me. I need to verify some information about it. Pamela frowned, taking the paper and examining it through her glasses, her brow furrowing in concentration. Yes, I remember this transaction. It was unusual. My heart rate quickened. Unusual how? She hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure no other customers were within earshot, clearly uncomfortable. Well, the gentleman who brought it and said his wife, you, I assume, had signed it but couldn't come in person due to a medical procedure. He had your ID and a signed authorization letter allowing him to represent you for the notarization. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. The elaborate nature of Alan's deception was becoming clear. Did you make a copy of the ID? Of course, she nodded, a professional reflex. Standard procedure. I need to see that copy, please. The ID he showed you wasn't mine. It was fraudulent. I tried to keep my voice steady, to project calm certainty rather than the panic bubbling beneath my composed exterior. Pamela's face paled, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. I'll need to check our records. She disappeared into a back office while I waited, heart pounding, studying the cheap commercial artwork on the walls, generic landscapes in plastic frames, to distract myself from the anxiety threatening to overwhelm me. A few minutes later, she returned with a file folder clutched tightly in her hands. Here it is, she said, showing me a photocopy of what appeared to be my driver's license. This is what he presented. I examined the copy closely, feeling a chill of recognition. It looked legitimate at first glance, my photo, my information, but the expiration date was wrong. My license had been renewed just 3 months earlier, but this one showed last year's date. And the signature, while similar to mine, had a slight slant I never used. This is fake, I told her, pointing out the discrepancies. And I never signed any authorization letter. I never signed that deed transfer. My ex-husband forged everything. Pamela looked stricken, her professional confidence visibly shaken. I'm so sorry. I followed protocol, but clearly he had gone to great lengths to She trailed off, visibly distressed, adjusting her glasses in a nervous gesture. This has never happened before in my 15 years as a notary. I need a statement from you, I said, seizing the moment of her contrition. Confirming that I was never here, that someone else presented documents claiming to be authorized by me. She nodded vigorously. Of course. Anything I can do to help. I'll write it up right now. She seemed almost relieved to have a concrete action to take, a way to begin making amends for her unwitting role in Alan's scheme. While Pamela prepared her statement in the back office, I browsed the store's display of packing materials, trying to appear casual despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. Jessica, the young clerk, sorted mail behind the counter, occasionally glancing at me with mild curiosity. I wondered how much she had observed of Alan's visit, whether she might be another potential witness. Pamela returned with a typed statement, signed and notarized. I've included everything I can remember about the man who came in, she explained, handing me the document. His appearance, what he was wearing, what he said. I hope it helps. Reading through her detailed description, I felt a surge of validation. The man was undeniably Alan, 6 feet tall, silver hair, expensive watch, charcoal suit, the slight scar on his right eyebrow from a childhood accident. She had even noted his cologne, the distinctive sandalwood scent he'd worn throughout our marriage. Armed with Pamela's statement and the copy of the fake ID, I returned home feeling marginally better. It was concrete evidence of Alan's fraud, proof that could help Margaret build our case. But my small victory was short-lived. A black SUV was parked in my driveway, a Range Rover with tinted windows. Alan's new car, purchased after the divorce, a status symbol to demonstrate that losing half his assets hadn't affected his prosperity. My steps faltered as I approached my own front door, keys clutched in my hand like a weapon. The new keys the locksmith had given me just yesterday, keys that Alan shouldn't have. Before I could decide whether to confront him or retreat, perhaps call the police or Margaret, the door swung open. Alan stood in the entryway, tall, fit, silver-haired, dressed in the tailored casual wear that was his uniform. The charcoal sweater I'd given him 2 Christmases ago, cashmere that brought out the gray in his eyes. He looked exactly as he had when we were married, exuding the confident charm that had once attracted me and now made my skin crawl. There you are, Becca, he said, smiling as if this were a normal social call, as if he hadn't broken into my home, as if he hadn't attempted to steal it out from under me. I let myself in. Hope you don't mind. You no longer have keys to this house, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, years of practice at hiding my emotions in his presence coming back instinctively. How did you get in? He shrugged, that familiar dismissive gesture that had always made me feel small, insignificant. I had copies made before I returned yours. Seemed prudent. His tone suggested I was naive for not expecting this, for trusting that he would honor even this basic boundary. You're trespassing, Alan. I've changed the locks since then. You broke in. I remained on the porch, unwilling to enter the house while he occupied it, aware of the neighbors who might witness this confrontation. Old Mrs. Turner was watering her hydrangeas across the street, pretending not to watch us while angling her hose unnecessarily in our direction. Is it really breaking in when I own the property? He countered, gesturing expansively at the living room behind him like a game show host displaying a prize. Technically, you're the one trespassing. We both know that deed transfer is fraudulent, I said, standing my ground though every instinct screamed to retreat, to escape his overwhelming presence. I've already spoken to the notary. I have proof you faked my ID and forged my signature. For a moment, his confident facade slipped, a flicker of surprise crossing his features, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Then he laughed, a sound I once found warm but now recognized as hollow, practiced, part of the charming persona he had crafted so carefully. Proof? Good luck with that. It'll be your word against mine, and I've got documented evidence of your signature on a legally filed deed. By the time you untangle this legally, if you even can, I'll have sold this place and moved on. He leaned against the doorframe, relaxed, as if we were discussing something trivial, as if he weren't threatening to leave me homeless. Why are you doing this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. You got the cabin, the retirement accounts. The settlement was more than fair. I thought of the hours in mediation, the careful division of assets that had seemed to finally end our connection to each other. Fair? His voice hardened, the facade cracking further to reveal the anger beneath. You took half of everything I built, everything I earned, while you played house. This house should have been mine too. I paid for it. With our joint income, I corrected, feeling a surge of the righteous anger that had sustained me through the worst of the divorce. And I was the one who restored it, who turned it into a home while you were busy with your affairs. The words were out before I could stop them, a direct reference to the betrayals we usually danced around in our post-divorce interactions. He waved this away like an annoying fly, as if my labor, my investment in our home, was negligible compared to his financial contribution. Ancient history. The point is, I want you out by the end of the week. I've got a buyer lined up who isn't particular about a quick occupancy inspection. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Without breaking eye contact with Ellen, I retrieved it and glanced at the screen. A text from Diane, got everything. Just say the word. I smiled, feeling a rush of confidence. I think you should leave now, Alan. He raised an eyebrow, amused by my defiance. Or what? In answer, I opened the front door wider. Diane stood on the porch with her iPad, which was clearly recording. Behind her stood two police officers, one middle-aged with a salt and pepper mustache, the other younger with close-cropped hair and an impassive expression. Officers, I said calmly, this is my ex-husband who has broken into my home after fraudulently attempting to transfer the deed to himself. I have evidence of both crimes and would like to press charges. The amusement drained from Alan's face, replaced by a cold fury I recognized all too well. It was the expression he'd worn whenever I defied him during our marriage, whenever I refused to bend to his will, a rare occurrence until the final year when I'd finally found my voice. Ms. Wells, one of the officers said, stepping forward, his hand resting casually near his belt, your neighbor called about a breaking and entering. Is this the individual in question? Yes, I confirmed, standing straighter. I have documentation proving the house is legally mine, despite his claims otherwise. Alan's lawyer-smooth persona snapped back into place like a mask sliding over his true face. Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. I have paperwork showing I'm the legal owner of this property. He has forged documents, I interjected, my voice gaining strength. I've never signed any transfer deed. I've already spoken with the notary who was tricked into authenticating it. The officers looked between us, clearly recognizing a complex situation beyond the usual B&E call. The older one scratched his mustache thoughtfully. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us to sort this out, the taller officer said to Alan. Breaking and entering is a serious offense, regardless of property disputes. This is ridiculous, Alan scoffed, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in boardrooms and country clubs. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have a choice, sir, the second officer said firmly. You can come voluntarily, or we can make this more difficult. For a moment, I thought Alan might resist. His jaw clenched, a vein pulsing in his temple. Then, with a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes, he straightened his designer jacket and nodded. Fine. But this isn't over, Becca. As the officers escorted him out, Diane stepped into the house and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. Her cardigan smelled of lavender and books, a comforting scent that reminded me of afternoons in libraries, of safety and order. I recorded everything from the moment he opened the door, she said, her iPad still clutched in her free hand. His admission about making extra keys, breaking in, the whole thing. I leaned into her support, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation draining away. Thank you, Diane. I don't know what I would have done without you. That's what neighbors are for, she said simply, guiding me to the sofa where I sank down, my legs finally giving way. Now, let's call your attorney and get her this recording right away. The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings, affidavits, and court appearances. Margaret moved quickly to file an emergency injunction preventing any sale or transfer of my property while the fraud investigation proceeded. Alan, charged with breaking and entering, forgery, and fraud, was released on bail but ordered to stay away from me and the house. To my surprise, I slept deeply that night after Alan's arrest, as if my body recognized that a threat had been neutralized, at least temporarily. I woke to sunshine streaming through my bedroom curtains and the realization that for the first time in months, I hadn't checked the locks multiple times before going to bed. Small victories, I thought as I made my morning coffee. Alan's attorney, a rail-thin man with expensive suits and a perpetual expression of mild disdain, reached out almost immediately, floating settlement offers that would have required me to give up the house in exchange for dropping the criminal charges. Each offer came with thinly veiled threats about the difficulty of proving fraud, the length of court proceedings, the cost of litigation. Margaret advised against accepting any of them. He's desperate, she explained during one of our strategy sessions in her office, its walls lined with legal texts and framed degrees. The evidence against him is substantial. The notary's statement, the fake ID, the recording of him admitting to breaking in, it's all very damning. And now that the police are involved, this has gone beyond a civil dispute. But can we prove he forged the deed? I asked, still worried about the legal tangle, the complexity of property law that seemed designed to favor those with resources to navigate it. We don't have to prove it beyond all doubt in civil court, she reminded me, her confident tone reassuring. We just need to convince a judge that the preponderance of evidence shows you never intended to transfer the property. Between your neighbor's testimony about your continuous residence, your utility bills, and the notary's statement about never actually seeing you, I'm confident we can do that. She was right. 3 months after receiving that registered letter, I sat in a courtroom as the judge, a stern woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, ruled in my favor, invalidating the fraudulent deed transfer and ordering Alan to pay my legal fees. The separate criminal case was still proceeding, with Alan facing potential jail time for the forgery and fraud charges. As we left the courthouse, descending the wide marble steps into the spring sunshine, Margaret turned to me with a smile. Congratulations, Rebecca. The house is officially yours again, though in reality, it never stopped being yours. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with lingering anxiety. Do you think he'll try something else? He'd be incredibly foolish to do so, she replied, adjusting her grip on her leather briefcase. But to be safe, I'd recommend keeping those security cameras installed. And perhaps consider getting a restraining order. I followed her advice, though part of me felt it unnecessary after Alan's legal humiliation. His reputation in our community was in tatters. His firm had placed him on leave pending the outcome of the criminal case. The buyer he'd lined up for my house had backed away from any dealings with him. Still, I found comfort in the small notification that pinged my phone whenever someone approached my front door, in the knowledge that my home was secure, monitored, protected. In the months that followed, I threw myself into making my house feel like mine again. I painted the living room a warm yellow that Alan had always vetoed, claiming it was too feminine, too country. I converted his home office into a crafting space where I could work on my stained glass, a hobby he had dismissed as frivolous but that had sustained me through the darkest days of our failing marriage. I planted new vegetables in the garden, nurturing them as symbols of my fresh start: heirloom tomatoes, purple basil, rainbow chard, plants chosen for their beauty as much as their utility. Diane became a regular visitor, joining me for coffee on Sunday mornings where we'd sit in my reading nook and discuss books or local politics or simply enjoy the quiet companionship that had become so precious to me. She introduced me to her book club, 5 women around our age who welcomed me without prying questions about my divorce or the subsequent legal battle that had become well known in our small community. "You know," she said during one such morning, about a year after the court case, sunlight dappling the table between us through the leaves of the maple tree outside, "you seem different now. Lighter somehow." I considered this as I sipped my coffee, from a new mug, hand-thrown pottery in shades of blue, the broken one long since discarded. "I think I am. It's not just about keeping the house, though that was important. It's about standing up for myself, refusing to be victimized again." "You did more than stand up for yourself," Diane pointed out, her librarian's precision with words making her observation all the more meaningful. "You outsmarted him at his own game." I smiled at that. Throughout our marriage, Alan had always positioned himself as the clever one, the strategic thinker, while treating me as if I were naive and simple. How satisfying it had been to watch his carefully constructed fraud crumble under the weight of evidence I had methodically gathered. I don't think I fully realized until this happened how much of his control I had internalized, I admitted, tracing the rim of my mug with my fingertip. Even after the divorce, I was still seeing myself through his eyes in some ways. This forced me to reclaim my own perspective. Diane nodded sagely. "Nothing like a crisis to clarify what's important." 2 years after Alan's attempt to steal my house, the criminal case finally concluded with a plea deal. He avoided jail time but received probation, community service, and a permanent mark on his record that would follow him through any future legal or financial transactions. I learned about it not from the courts or from Alan, but from a real estate listing that popped up in my email alerts, the ones I'd set up during the divorce to monitor property values in my neighborhood. The vacation cabin was for sale. Alan's cabin, the one he had fought so viciously to keep in our divorce. The listing photos showed it unchanged from when we had shared it, the stone fireplace where we had roasted marshmallows during winter getaways, the deck where we had watched sunsets over the mountains, the small bedroom where we had made love during happier times. The listing price was well below market value, suggesting a motivated seller. On impulse, I forwarded the listing to Margaret with a question: would it be crazy to buy it? Her response came quickly: "Not crazy." Poetic justice. "But are you sure you want a piece of your past?" I pondered this as I moved through my house, my secure, transformed home that now reflected me rather than us. The truth was, I had loved that cabin independently of Alan. It had been our escape during the marriage, but it had also been the one place where I felt closest to nature, to a sense of peace that had eluded me in our everyday life. The memories it held weren't all tainted by his betrayal. It was never about the past, I replied to Margaret. It was always about the future I wanted to build. 6 months later, I turned the key in the cabin's lock for the first time as its sole owner. Alan had sold it for far less than its worth, eager to liquidate assets as his legal and professional troubles mounted. I had purchased it through an LLC Margaret had helped me establish, keeping my identity hidden from him. The cabin smelled musty from disuse, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that streamed through the windows. I walked through the small rooms, running my hands over familiar surfaces, noting the repairs and updates I wanted to make. Already the space felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. I was no longer the woman who had survived in the margins of her husband's life. I was someone who claimed her space boldly, who fought for what was hers, who built boundaries and enforced them. On the deck, watching the sun sink below the tree line, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold, I raised a glass of wine in a private toast. To the house I had defended. To the cabin I had reclaimed. To the future I was building, room by room, day by day, on my own terms. The registered letter that had arrived 2.5 years earlier had been meant to destroy me, to leave me homeless and frightened. Instead, it had ultimately led me here, to a fuller version of the life I wanted, one where I owned not just one home, but two. One where I recognized my own strength, my own wisdom, my own worth. As dusk deepened into night, the first stars appearing above the silhouetted mountains, I thought about the long journey from that moment of shock in my kitchen to this peaceful evening. Alan had tried to forge my signature, to rewrite my future against my will. But in the end, I had reclaimed the pen. I was the author of my own story now, and no one would ever take that power from me again. The next morning, I woke early to the sound of birdsong filtering through the cabin windows, chickadees and nuthatches, the occasional raucous call of a Steller's jay. I made coffee in the French press I'd brought with me and took it outside, breathing in the crisp mountain air as I surveyed what was now my land, my trees, my peaceful retreat. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "How's the cabin? Living your best revenge life yet?" I smiled as I typed my response, "Not revenge. Reclamation." Setting down my phone, I pulled out the notebook I'd brought with me, filled with ideas for the cabin's renovation. Unlike my approach with the house, where I had methodically erased traces of Alan with new colors and configurations, here I planned to build upon what already existed. The bones of the place were good, it just needed refreshing, updating, expanding in ways that would make it more fully mine. Rather like me, I thought with a smile. Later that day, as I was measuring the living room windows for new curtains, I was thinking of a deep forest green to complement the natural wood tones. There was a knock at the door. I tensed instinctively, few people knew I was here, and the cabin was relatively isolated, nestled among pines at the end of a gravel road. Cautiously, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. A woman in a sheriff's deputy uniform stood on the porch, looking professional but not particularly concerned. Her badge caught the afternoon sunlight, gleaming against her tan uniform. I opened the door, my pulse still quickened. "Can I help you, Ms. Wells?" When I nodded, she continued, "I'm Deputy Garcia. We do courtesy check-ins with new property owners in the area, especially those who might not be year-round residents. Just wanted to introduce myself and let you know how to reach us if you need anything." Relief washed through me. "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." "No problem. This is a quiet area, but it's always good to know your neighbors and local resources." She handed me a card with contact information. "There's a property owners association that meets monthly if you're interested. Good way to get to know folks." After she left, I returned to my measuring with a renewed sense of belonging. This wasn't just a victory lap or a thumb in Alan's eye, it was another fresh start, another community to potentially join. I imagined myself attending those monthly meetings, perhaps volunteering for a committee, becoming known not as Alan's ex-wife but as Rebecca, the woman with the blue cabin who makes stained glass art. Over the next few months, I split my time between the house and the cabin, establishing a rhythm that felt both adventurous and grounding. 3 days in the city maintaining my primary home and social connections, 4 days in the mountains working on cabin renovations and exploring the surrounding wilderness. I joined the Property Owners Association as Deputy Garcia had suggested, meeting neighbors whose cabins had previously been just distant lights through the trees. I hired local craftsmen to help with the more substantial projects, replacing the aging deck, installing new energy-efficient windows, upgrading the ancient heating system to something that wouldn't require constant feeding of wood stoves. But I did much of the cosmetic work myself, finding satisfaction in the physical labor of transformation. I stripped and refinished cabinets, painted walls, laid new tile in the small bathroom. Each completed project felt like another step in my reclamation. I invited Diane for weekends, introduced her to hiking trails and quiet fishing spots. Sometimes Margaret joined us, our professional relationship having evolved into friendship during the crucible of the legal battle. We'd sit on my new deck as evening fell, drinking wine and watching deer emerge from the forest edge to graze in the small meadow behind the cabin. "You know," Margaret said during one such weekend, as we sat around a campfire sipping wine, embers rising to meet the stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky, "I've handled hundreds of divorce cases, but yours was unique. Because my ex tried to steal my house through fraud?" I asked Riley, poking at the fire with a stick, watching sparks fly upward. She shook her head, her face warm in the firelight. "No, because of how you responded. Most people in your position would have been shattered by what he did. They might have fought legally, but they would have been fighting from a place of victimhood, of fear." I was terrified, I admitted, remembering that moment in my kitchen when I'd first opened the registered letter, the way my coffee cup had slipped from my fingers. "Yes, but you channeled that fear into methodical action. You gathered evidence. You built alliances." She gestured to include Diane. "You outmaneuvered him not by matching his dishonesty, but by being smarter, more thorough, more strategic." I hadn't thought of it quite that way before. In the moment, I had been operating on instinct and necessity, not conscious strategy. But looking back, I could see what she meant. I had approached the crisis with the same attention to detail that I brought to my stained glass work: careful planning, precise execution, a clear vision of the desired outcome. "I had good help," I said, raising my glass to both of them, gratitude warming me more than the fire. "You had good help because you asked for it," Diane pointed out, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. That's another thing the old Rebecca might not have done. She was right. The woman I had been during my marriage would have been too ashamed to reach out, too convinced of her own inadequacy to believe she deserved assistance. Alan had cultivated that uncertainty in me, that hesitation to claim space or ask for what I needed. His attempt to steal my house had backfired spectacularly, not just in the legal sense, but in how it had forced me to shed those last vestiges of self-doubt he had planted in my psyche. 3 years to the day after receiving that fateful registered letter, I hosted a small gathering at the cabin. Diane was there, and Margaret, along with new friends from both neighborhoods, the cabin community and my street back in the city. We ate on the newly expanded deck I had designed myself and hired local craftsmen to build, the mountain sunset painting us all in hues of gold and amber. A toast, Diane announced, raising her glass and commanding attention with her librarian's authority. To Rebecca, who turned a potential tragedy into triumph. Who built not just one beautiful home, but two. Who reminds us all that our worst moments can lead to our best lives. As glasses clinked and voices echoed agreement, I felt a profound sense of completion. The circle that had begun with that shocking discovery in my kitchen had closed. What Alan had intended as my ending had become my beginning. Later, after my guests had departed and I was alone in the cabin under a canopy of stars, I thought about how precarious our sense of security can be, how a single document, a forged signature, can threaten to unravel the life we've built. But I also reflected on how resilience works, how we can piece together new certainties from the fragments of broken trust. Alan had tried to leave me homeless, but in doing so, he had inadvertently led me to a fuller understanding of what home truly meant. Not just walls and a roof, not just legal ownership, but a sense of belonging to oneself, of authoring one's own story, of claiming space in the world unapologetically. In the quiet darkness of the cabin that was now indisputably mine, I made a silent promise to myself, to never again allow anyone to make me feel small or uncertain, to never again doubt my right to occupy space in the world, to never again shy away from fighting for what was rightfully mine. The registered letter had been meant to begin my unraveling. Instead, it had initiated my reconstruction, stronger, clearer, more authentically myself than I had ever been before. As I drifted toward sleep, the mountain air cool and fresh through the open window, I felt gratitude not just for what I had salvaged, but for what I had discovered, the depth of my own strength, the solidity of true friendship, the power of standing firmly in my truth. Alan had forged my signature in an attempt to rewrite my future. But the future, I had learned, belongs to those who refuse to surrender their pen, those who insist on writing their own story, page by page, home by home, day by day.